makes Dom Pérignon such a great luxury brand, apart from, it's really expensive and it's really great?
It is the largest produced luxury wine in the world, 5 million bottles of it. Even at that production level, it's able to have maintained its status, its scarcity, and its quality. So to have been able to establish such a success, keep that story there, keep some prestige, keep the prestige of the brand while having expanded,
That is amazing. And I guess it's the story as well of the monk, Dom Pérignon.
he was probably influential in establishing how champagne is made, but he didn't invent it. And I don't think his name was necessarily that big back then. That's the beauty of storytelling, right? He's become this mythical, bigger than life figure that when he was alive probably was just like a pretty good winemaker.
Yeah.
Do you have a thirst to learn about wine? Do you love stories about wonderfully obsessive people, hauntingly beautiful places, and amusingly awkward social situations? Well, that's the blend here on the Unreserved Wine Talk podcast. I'm your host, Natalie McLean, and each week I share with you unfiltered conversations with celebrities in the wine world, as well as confessions from my own tipsy journey as I write my third book on this subject. I'm so glad you're here. Now pass me that bottle, please, and let's get started.
Welcome to episode 143. What are the 6 key elements that define a luxury wine? What'll surprise you about Dom Pérignon that makes it different from other luxury wines? And which 2 wine gadgets must you own as a wine lover? You'll get those answers and more wine tips in our second part of our chat with Robert Vernick and Peter Yeung, the co-hosts of XChateau podcast. If you missed our first conversation last week, no worries, you can still listen to this one, but then go back and take a listen because I think you'll enjoy it as well. In the show notes, you'll find a full transcript of our conversation, links to both of my books, how you can join me in a free online wine and food pairing class, and where you can find me on Zoom, Instagram, Facebook, and YouTube live video every Wednesday at 7 p.m. That's all in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/143. Now, on a personal note, before we dive into the show, I just binge watched Good Girls Revolt. It's the story of a group of young women working at Newsweek in the 70s. They're all researchers, but aspire to be reporters like the men they assist. The laws have changed, but not the reality of the workplace when it comes to promotions. I just love the final episode. I won't give it away, but it reminds me a lot of the wine industry. And after decades of good girl compliance, I'm ready for a revolt, starting with my memoir. Okay, on with the show. Let's talk about the luxury category. Peter, you've written the book. Show us the book. Luxury Wine Marketing. You wrote the book literally with Dr. Liz Tosh.
Mm-hmm.
Which university does she work at?
Sonoma State.
Oh, great. So you two collaborated on this book. So let's start off with, what is a luxury wine beyond an expensive one?
Yeah, and I think that's important because I think people just think price normally when they think of delineating that. And price is a good shorthand for the most part, but it's not enough, right? To be a luxury product, you have to be desired. And we have 6 elements that define what a luxury wine is. So it's really high quality, of course, coming from a special place. I think that's very specific for wine, that terroir and everything is unique. There's a sense of scarcity. So it may not be that's actually scarce, but there's at least a sense of scarcity, and some that's driven by price. It has a high price, elevated price point. It provides a sense of privilege, and I think that's true of all luxury goods, right? Where it helps you differentiate people just with that sense of privilege. You feel special for having it, enjoying it, and it provokes pleasure. So I think that for wine is a very specific element where it gives you all sorts of pleasure mentally as well as physically, and it's something you can share with others.
Absolutely. That's a great definition, very holistic. When I think of luxury wines, I think of like Domaine Romani Conti, the icon Burgundian wine that probably goes for hundreds, if not thousands of dollars a bottle when it's released. And so I tend to think that it's a very small market, the luxury wine market, but it's surprisingly larger than we think. How big is the market, Peter?
We thought it was, might be too small too. And so when we actually did the market sizing in for shorthand about $100 above, we found it was a $5 billion a year market. So it was much bigger than we anticipated and what other people thought it would be.
And 5 billion, is that US or worldwide?
Worldwide.
Worldwide. Okay. Yeah. All right.
Annual. Yeah.
Wow. That's pretty huge. Robert, what's the best luxury wine that you've ever tasted? And what is the one that's on your bucket list?
Oh, I mean, I've had the luxury of tasting a lot of nice wines over the years. I haven't had the big two from Domaine Romani Conti, La Tâche and Romani Conti. Those are two on my list. I've had all the other wines from them, but I haven't had that. So those are on my list. But there's a whole wide range of wines that would be on that list in terms of that. It's always hard to pick, like, what's your best one or favorite one that you haven't had?
Sure. Do you have one from California, Robert? Would it be one from like a cult wine from California that you'd love to try?
Or that you've had?
Yeah, I've had most of them. There's nothing that I'm like dying to try and haven't had. So yeah, being in California, it's a little easier to get those than some of those other ones.
Yeah, they're in your backyard, so to speak.
I really remember trying at, I guess, the winery or at the Abbey. I had a tasting with Dom Pérignon and the winemaker at the time.
In Champagne.
And so we had the last 5 vintages, I think, of the regular wine, and then 2 P2s, and then a P3, which was the 73, I believe.
Why do they call it P3? Oh, is it Pérignon, shorthand?
No, Plénitude.
Plénitude.
So it's aged in the bottle certainly longer, so they keep some stock aging from that vintage. And then they're tasting it all the time, and when it hits what they consider Richard Geoffroy at the time, he's since retired.
Richard? That was
he's the winemaker.
Okay,
was the winemaker. When they taste and then it hits that next level of quality, I guess, or the next expression, they call it Plénitude, and then they bottle a bunch and they sell it for a lot more money. And then they wait again, and when it hits that next level again, and so it's not just the same wine aged longer, like that was already bottled or disgorged and aged longer. It was aged on lees for decades. The P3 was incredibly fresh and vibrant, and just, it was amazing. There was all these sort of tropical citrus and other things that you don't normally get out of champagne. And if I scored wine and said it was like, that would be 100-point wine for me.
Wow, that sounds beautiful. And so P3, is it from a certain vintage or just as it ages? Okay.
It was from a certain, so it was like, I believe the 73 vintage. I have it in my notes somewhere.
Yeah.
And this was 3 or 4 years ago, maybe like 2018, I think, or probably 2017. And so it had been aging all that time and was just recently disgorged. And so, like late disgorged, this is like very late disgorged.
Yeah, decades later. Wow. And the lees, just for anyone who might be listening and isn't sure what those are the spent or the dead yeast cells, but it gives it a very creamy, rich texture when wine is aged on the lees. And so, like, approximately, I know, like, can't nail it, but Dom Pérignon itself, sort of, I can't even say basic Dom Pérignon, that's an oxymoron, but when it's released, is it about $300 a bottle-ish?
In the US, I think it's around $175 or so.
Okay. I must be thinking Canadian dollars then. That would make sense. And then a Plénitude, like how much more would that be in a second and a third?
So the P2s are usually in the $300 to $400 range, and the P3s are usually $1,000 plus. 1,000 could be like 2,000 or 3,000, because that's literally decades in very small production.
Wow. And what makes Dom Pérignon such a great luxury brand, apart from, it's really expensive and it's really great, so quality and price are there, but what is it about that brand that really works for it?
I think one of the things that's very distinctive about it and how it's amazing is how big it is. Everyone has heard of it, one, and then two, it's like, it is, I think, the largest produced luxury wine in the world. when they make wine, which isn't every year, but almost every year, like 5 million bottles of it. So champagne has like littered with underground cellars of Dom Pérignon in it. But even at that production level, it's able to have maintained its status, its scarcity, and its quality. We just talked about how good the wines are, right? And so even collectors, like semi-collectors, Robert's more of a collector than me, maybe a semi-collector, still cherish and value that wine and that brand. So to have been able to establish such a success, keep that story there, keep some prestige, keep the prestige of the brand while having expanded, it's, versus like Krug is, even though it's in the same house, they're all owned by LVMH, is much, much smaller. It's 20,000 cases, I think, versus like a few hundred. It's like 10 times smaller than Dom Pérignon.
Wow. And it's what is the LVMH? It's Louis
Vuitton, Moet
Hennessy.
Hennessy. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So they
all the
own
luxury
everything
brands.
from Louis Vuitton to Sephora to, Colgan cellars and Napa, and to a bunch of champagne houses, including Moet and Chandon and Dom Pérignon and Krug and some of the other top wines of the world.
That is amazing. And I guess it's the story as well of the monk, Dom Pérignon. What's true and what's not true? He was a blind monk Benedictine?
Yeah, and he was probably influential in establishing how champagne is made, but he didn't necessarily invent it, and I don't think his name was, necessarily that big back then, but that's sort of the beauty of the storytelling, right? He's become this mythical, bigger than life figure that when he was alive probably was just like, a pretty good winemaker.
Yeah, that's true. I think you've written about this, Peter, but I'd love to hear Robert's take. But I think sometimes the story is as important as the brand, and especially if there's an element of struggle. Perhaps for him, it's maintaining his vows and making the best wine he can, but there's also a rags to riches story that can come with these brands too, right?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the story is so critical. When I worked and helped manage Costa Brown Winery in Sonoma, the story of the founders who saved their tip money in a tip jar every day working at a restaurant in Santa Rosa to start their passion project of Pinot Noir and wine to, having now sold it a couple times, but becoming one of the more, I think, iconic names in California Pinot Noir is certainly, you could have rags to riches stories in wine.
Huh. So Robert Peters talked about 4 categories of luxury wine buyers. In which of those categories would you place yourself when you do buy a luxury wine?
I'll remind him that they're the luxury wine buyer, the wine collector, the wine geek, and the aspirational buyer.
There you go.
Yeah, I'd probably be in the wine geek or aspirational buyer.
And tell us about those, Robert. Yeah.
I always spend money on wine, and I kind of hunt out. I never buy things in cases. I'll buy one-offs, but I'll usually buy multiple things from a producer to just sort of understand their style, see if I like it, maybe even a couple of vintages, in one-off bottles. And if I start to like it, I think it'd be interesting to collect. I would maybe buy 3. Like, that's my magic number, is like I can drink one early on, and I can chicken on one. And if I was too early, I could hold one back. So that's like my magic number of buying things if I really start to like it. And as I've gotten older, I'm basically buying less things, but better things. So I'm always kind of looking, because I can't afford to buy, I don't have the DRC or Roumier or Rousseau allocation. So I'm kind of looking for that next level down, which is kind of like people who are starting to get better. But at a certain point, some of those producers are going to get too expensive for me as well. So I'm always kind of looking for that third layer down, where it's like people who are kind of on the rise. And a lot of my collecting is either on some of the high end stuff in Napa, but also a lot of Burgundy. And I always have a couple Bordeauxs that I buy as well, just because I really love aged Bordeaux. Those are the main areas that I kind of buy things on in new releases.
I would have said Robert was on the intersection of wine geek and wine collector, because the aspirational buyer is someone who's looking up at a true luxury buyer who might be someone like LeBron James is actually pretty knowledgeable about wine, but like a celebrity or someone who's like truly wealthy, who's just buying high-end wine brands because they know it's good, but they're not really like super into wine. And aspirational buyers often look up to those people, and they want to feel that luxury. So they'll buy what I would call an everyday luxury wine, like $100 to $200 bottle of wine, to have a connection with that. versus the wine geek is someone who's like interested in all these different intricacies and different brands and regions and whatnot. And I think Robert and I both fall in that category, but I think his collection is a little better than mine. And so like, I'd say he's maybe at that intersection with the collector, not a full collector who's really interested in all the scores and what's rare and things like that, but in that intersection of collector and geek.
And what motivates that collector to buy? Is it just the idea of having trophy wines in the cellar, or what's the motivation there?
Well, I think there's some people in general who just like to collect things. They see value in the story of having different things. I probably am in that category, and my mom tries to get me to get rid of this all the time, but like all the comic books that are stored at her house are like sports cards from the 80s and 90s that are worthless. But like,
you never know. One card might make your fortune.
yeah. I've tried to look it up to see if that was worth anything now, because collectibles have gone crazy during the pandemic, but they're like, nah, still not worth anything. That was the junk card era where they just overproduced everything. But some people just love that collecting. Some people like that it increases in value, that some of it increases in value. And some people like that rarity, that scarcity element to say, I own this bottle when it's super rare and hard to find and things like that. And I can show my friends and that sort of thing.
Yeah, it was kind of like getting into a concert or a bar before the person became famous. Like I just paid the cover charge to the bar to see whatever, bad example, but Celine Dion or whatever before she hit Vegas. Sorry, Robert, what were you going to say?
The collection aspect's interesting. For me, it's like, can I get something that's obscure and interesting and hard to get and share it with other people that are like-minded, right? And so for me, it's more of like, I don't buy it just to let it sit there and appreciate and value. I buy it to drink it and actually enjoy it with other people.
And to share with them an experience they might not find for themselves. That's a good aspect to it. Well, this is making me thirsty. I've got water, but you have wine. So show me which bottles you both have with you today. Peter, what do you have there?
I have a 2013 Odero Barolo. I've made it easier for my sister to buy me birthday presents. So she buys me 3 bottles of this wine every year for my birthday.
Nice sister. Wow, that's great.
Yeah, so Barolo, as we talked about, was the wine that got me into wine. And so we tried a few different producers, and I really like it. Odero has a little bit more of a modern style, but still the classicism, I think, of Barolo and the perfume that's out there and the structure and ability to age for decades, which is always a good thing.
Awesome. And how would you describe it in terms of the aroma, the smells that you're getting?
Well, it's got that floral, like almost potpourri kind of aromas. The little bit of that tar, they say tar and roses for Barolo, so it has a touch of earthiness to it as well, and a little bit of oak influence, so a touch of like toast and cedar, and then on the palate that just like melts because it's got a little bit of age to it, so it kind of melts into the mouth and into your saliva glands, right? Of that acid kind of kicking up. And Italian wines you almost always need to pair with food, right?
Yes.
As you're the expert on. So at 8:50 in the morning, it's actually tasting pretty good after brushing my teeth and everything. Yet it's still good. The mark of a great wine, right?
Yes, we'll have to pick breakfast cereals or something. That's great. Which one do you have with you, Robert?
So I was just up in Sonoma yesterday for the weekend. Okay. So I stopped and visited Rain, which is a relatively new producer, which is Carlo and Dante Mondavi, who are the sons of Tim Mondavi.
Oh, okay. It's called Rain as in the rain?
No, RAEN. And it's Research in Agriculture of Enology Naturally. So that's what it stands for.
Okay.
So this is Fort Ross Seaview, their Seafield Vineyard, right as the Pacific Ocean's coming in. They have these little coastal hills, and they're just above the fog line on one of those bluffs out there in northern Sonoma coast. So super interesting producer, like, a lot of systemic inclusion, but like, what is this? Probably like 12.5 alcohol, like really low alcohol, really kind of different style of California Pinot Noir. And I like that they talk about the farming. I like that they have a very specific point of view with their wines. And I think that there's a lot of things in California Pinot Noir that isn't great. And so it's always great to highlight the ones that are doing a good job.
Awesome. And what does it smell like to you?
So I definitely get like this like rose hip and like rose stem, like floral notes from that stem inclusion. Definitely get a lot of kind of like ripe cranberry, red currant, sour cherry. It's very tart on the nose, red crunchy fruits, but good floral, a little bit of earth spice in there as well. And then there's a pretty low usage of oak as well in terms of new oak.
Okay. Oh, that sounds good. And Peter, back to you. Apart from breakfast, what would you pair your Barolo with?
Well, I think it could go with a very hearty pasta with like a sugo or ragu would go really well with it. Or, it's like a braised meat, like an ossobuco or something, I think would go really well. Something with a little fat to cut all the tannin and acid.
Right.
And then meld with those slight floral, herbal, and earthy notes. I think that those would be pretty good pairings.
That sounds great. Robert, what would you put that Pinot Noir with?
Yeah, I'm not hung up on pairings, but I definitely think this could go. I mean, something like what Peter mentioned would be way too heavy for this wine. I think it would overpower. I think you go with things like pork or like roast chicken or like pork just depends on how you cook them and what kind of things. I think that pork loin and those things would go well. I think some heavier fish dishes could go well as well, or lighter pastas could go as well. But in general, like, because it has such good acidity, something with a little bit of fat, this acidity helps cut through that and kind of like adds almost as like anything you'd put like a cranberry sauce with or like duck would work as well.
Nice. Oh, that's great. Wow. I know what I'm having for breakfast.
Duck and ossobuco.
Yeah, exactly. To get the day started right. So you both have gadgets, because I love to learn about new gadgets. Peter, let's start with the one that you have. Tell us about it and why you like it.
So this is a repour. It's a little stopper that just goes into the bottle. And as a wine student, I need to keep a lot of wines open and just taste them. And so I need to keep them fresh. And so this works for a single bottle, theoretically, although it has the capacity, I think, to absorb 2 liters of air. Basically, those like little sachets in different food packages that absorb oxygen. There's basically one of those inside here. It's more complicated than that, I think.
Okay.
It's basically how it works. And so you just stick it in after you open the bottle and it'll absorb the oxygen and keep your wine fresh for weeks or months. And so it's designed to at least take like 5 glasses out. And so especially for, I have to keep a wide range of wines open. And so especially for screw caps or plastic corks or other things, because sometimes I'll use a corvin as well. I think the repour works really well.
Wow. And is it reusable, like on multiple bottles?
This version is not. I think he's working on one that is, but it is made from recyclable materials. And they have a recycling program where you can send it back, like those Nespresso little capsules that you could send back. Yeah. And technically you could use it depending on how you drink the wine. You could use it on multiple bottles, but then you'd have to like track how much oxygen it's absorbed.
Sure. And how much are they approximately?
I think they're about between $1 and $2, depending on how many you buy at a time.
Sure. Oh, that's cool. And how would you compare its effectiveness with, say, a preserve spray if you've tried sprays?
I think these work much, much better. The only difference with the preserve spray, the one thing that sometimes is challenging is that, so it's got these little like ridges that stick in. And so sometimes if there's CO2 or something else in the wine, the things will like kind of pop out.
Oh.
So he said to like kind of like screw it in almost. But the preserve sprays work okay. But the problem is you're putting argon in and then trying to close it back. In that process of closing it back, air can come in. And so that can potentially damage the wine and not work that well.
It only gets the surface oxygen too, right? It only displaces the surface. Like there's actually oxygen that's been kind of bound with the wine, right?
That's a good point. That's the other thing too. Like, because it scavenges the oxygen, there's dissolved oxygen in the wine. And so Robert's point of it, it's only getting the oxygen on the surface, but this can actually absorb. Sometimes this works too well and the wine becomes a little reductive and you need to open it up after you preserve it. And normally after you open it up, you can hear like a little pop sometimes from that suction in there because it'll scavenge the oxygen that's even dissolved in the wine as well.
Cool. That's great. I need to try that. I haven't tried those. So thank you for showing me that. And Robert, what do you have?
I have the Durand corkscrew opener. So it's basically standard kind of like corkscrew helix and an asso, but a collector, I think in the South, in the US, basically patented this device and put them two together. You really only want to use this if you're drinking something that's 20 plus years old. So I typically use it on things that are like 30 years old or older. So if you're a restaurant and you're have old wine on the list or opening old wine for people, like these are great to have. Obviously, you open old wines with regular corkscrews or even just an asso, but sometimes it kind of like solves the problems that both of them have. So when you're putting the helix into an old bottle and you start to pull, a lot of times it's the cork so soft that you shred the cork. And then with the asso, sometimes the cork is so loose that when you try to slab it on the side, it punches it in. And so you put this in and it stabilizes it, and then you put this as a cross. And the real thing is like, 'cause you can actually do something like this, and I've done this in the past before I own this. You can use like a regular waiter's corkscrew and then put the asso on top of it. The problem is that you have a lot of gap, like, because usually the corkscrew would be up to about here, and therefore you can't get a good grip on some of those older, longer corks. And this helps remove really old corks from bottles. And a couple of weeks ago, I opened probably like about 20 old bottles with some friends. And, our oldest bottle was 1937, and we pulled that out. And so we pulled out a bunch of old bottles, a couple 61s and a 49, and everything came out flawlessly with this. I've had a couple times where the cork was just so gone that nothing was going to save it. You probably should have used port tongs to get that out. But if you like and drink older wines, again, 25 plus years old, it's worth the investment because it is not cheap. It's around $125, I think, in the US.
$125.
So,
wow.
yeah.
At least it's reusable. Would it work on just dried corks of wines that aren't necessarily old? Like, would it be useful for that as well?
I mean, sure.
Yeah. I use it for corks that I break. So like you break it in half and there's like that little nub or half a cork in. It works really well for that too. I actually use it much more broadly. I use it usually when it's 10 plus years old.
Okay.
Yeah, I use an asso a lot. Like I prefer the asso over a helix in general. So that works fine for me for 10 to 15 years old.
Well, I've got two things for my shopping list. All right. Thank you both for those. That's great. So as we wrap up, this has been fabulous. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you'd like to mention?
No?
Nope, we covered it all.
Yeah,
okay.
check out our podcast, XChateau. We'd love to.
Yeah.
Yes. Please tell us where we can find you. Now, podcast listeners, look for XChateau, X with the chateau. But where can we find you online for your website and so on?
Sure. So XChateau.com is the main thing. And then obviously searching that on any podcast locations there. And then on Instagram, we have X_Chateau for our user account there. And then my personal is at Wine Terroir or wineterroir.com. Also Wine Terroir on YouTube.
And XChateau has a LinkedIn account that I manage as well. So since it's a business podcast, it makes sense that we're on LinkedIn as well.
Cool. That's great. Well, Peter, Robert, thank you so much for this. It's been a great conversation. Really appreciate it. And I look forward to our next conversation.
Thanks for having us.
Okay. Bye for now. Well, there you have it. I hope you enjoyed our second chat with Peter and Robert. Here are my top takeaways. Number one, I found their discussion of the elements that make a wine a luxury brand fascinating, especially the psychological motives beyond simply drinking a great wine. 2, it's quite a feat for Dom Pérignon to produce 5 million bottles almost every year and still have consumers believe in its rarity, scarcity, and premium positioning. 3, brand stories are central no matter what you're selling. People relate to people, not things. We remember the story of Dom Pérignon, even if we get some aspects of it confused, like that he tried to get the bubbles out of the wine, not in. And he was a master blender, so he does deserve a lot of credit for that. And 4, I've since purchased a box of re-pour closures, and I think they're making a big difference. I also bought the Duran corkscrew, though I've yet to use it. I'm really hoping for a dried out cork really soon. In the show notes, you'll find a full transcript of our conversation, how you can join me in a free online wine and food pairing class, links to both of my books, where you can find me on Zoom, Insta, Facebook, YouTube, live video every Wednesday at 7 p.m. That's all in the show notes at nataliemclean.com/143. You won't want to miss next week when I chat with Paul Kay, host of his own podcast. We're turning the tables and he's interviewing me. I'm spilling more beans. In the meantime, if you missed episode 86, go back and take a listen. I chat about wine marketing secrets with Dr. Tim Dodd. I'll share a short clip with you now to whet your appetite. What are the big differences between the way men and women buy wine?
Men tend to be trophy buyers, so they buy for cellars and they like to have things that are rare and exceptional, whereas women are a lot more sort of practical for more immediate consumption. They're conscious of colour and labels, a lot more so than men. And then when people go into a tasting room, they get a free visit around the winery. They get a couple of free glasses of wine and have a great experience. Women tend to buy wine out of a feeling of obligation. They feel obligated because they've had such a great experience.
If you like this episode, please tell one friend about it this week, especially someone you know who'd be interested in the tips that Robert and Peter shared. Thank you for taking the time to join me here. I hope something great is in your glass this week. Perhaps a wine that you consider a luxury.
You don't want to miss one juicy episode of this podcast, especially the secret, full-bodied bonus episodes that I don't announce on social media. So, subscribe for free now at nataliemclean.com/subscribe. Meet me here next week. Cheers.